For most people, a birthday is a foundational pillar of their personal history. It is the one day of the year where your existence is acknowledged simply because you are there. It is a baseline of affection. In my family, however, October 14th was a blind spot. It was a structural error in the calendar, a glitch that my parents, in their pursuit of a perfect, curate life, simply learned to edit out. To understand the silence of my birthdays, you have to understand the noise of my brothers. My brother, Elias, was born on June 3rd. In our household, June 3rd was not merely a date, it was a festival. It marked the beginning of summer in our suburban Connecticut town, a season perfectly suited for the kind of loud, performative love my parents excelled at. My father, a man who leveraged debt to appear wealthy, and my mother, a woman who treated social standing like a contact sport, worshipped at the altar of Elias. Elias was the prototype. He was loud, charismatic, and athletically gifted, the golden retriever of human beings. He demanded attention not by asking for it, but by occupying so much space that ignoring him was physically impossible. I, on the other hand, was Arthur. I was the practice child, the first draft they had scribbled out before perfecting the formula. I was quiet, bookish, and possessed a stillness that unnerved them. I didn't play soccer. I organized the pantry. I didn't scream when I was hurt. I went to my room to bleed in private. The dynamic was established early, but it solidified into iron law in 1996. That year, June 3rd, was a coronation. Elias turned 12. My parents threw a party that reportedly cost more than our sedan. They rented an inflatable obstacle course that took up the entire backyard. They hired a catering company that served miniature crab cakes, despite the fact that 12-year-olds generally prefer pizza. And the pièce de résistance, my father bought Elias a dirt bike. I remember the moment vividly. It was a Honda XR80, bright red, sitting in the driveway with a bow on the handlebars. Elias screamed. He jumped on it, revving the engine until the neighbors peered out from behind their curtains. My father stood with his hands on his hips, beaming, basking in the reflected glory of his son's joy. My mother sipped her Chardonnay, looking at the other parents to ensure they were adequately jealous. "He's a natural," my father bellowed as Elias tore up the impeccably manicured lawn. "Born to ride!" I stood on the porch, holding a paper plate with a half-eaten hot dog. "Happy birthday, Elias," I whispered. No one heard me. The engine was too loud. 4 months later, the leaves turned. The air grew crisp. The calendar rolled over to October 14th. I was turning 10. Double digits. In the taxonomy of childhood, turning 10 is a massive leap. It is the bridge between being a little kid and a young man. I woke up that morning with a specific frequency of vibration in my chest, a mix of hope and anxiety. I knew, logically, that I wasn't Elias. I knew there would be no dirt bike. I didn't want a dirt bike. I wanted a book on astronomy. I wanted a telescope. Mostly, I just wanted the day to feel different than October 13th. I walked into the kitchen at 7 a.m. My mother was standing at the counter, aggressively buttering toast. She was wearing her silk robe, the one she wore when she had a migraine coming on. "Arthur," she said, without turning around, "don't scuff your feet. I just waxed the floor." I froze. "Sorry." I sat at the table. My father was hidden behind the Wall Street Journal. The radio was playing a weather report about a coming frost. I waited. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I ate my cereal, the crunching sound echoing in my head like a gunshot. Maybe they're playing a trick, I thought. Maybe they're going to surprise me before the bus comes. "Richard," my mother said, turning to my father, "did you call the landscaper? The leaves are a disaster. If the Gables see our yard like this, they'll think we're destitute." "I'll call him from the office," my father grunted. Then he lowered the paper and looked at me. For a second, my heart leaped. This was it. "Arthur," he said, "you left your sneakers in the hallway again. If I trip over them, you're paying for the hip surgery." "Yes, sir," I said. I went to school. I spent the entire day in a fugue state. When the teacher wrote the date on the chalkboard, October 14th, 1996, I stared at it until the white chalk blurred. I came home. I did my homework. I set the table for dinner. Dinner was meatloaf. Again. There was no cake. There were no presents. There was no happy birthday. The conversation revolved entirely around Elias's soccer tryouts, which were scheduled for the following weekend. My mother was worried about his cleats. She thought they looked shabby. "We'll go to the mall on Saturday," my father promised Elias. "Get you the top-tier ones. Can't have you slipping out there?" I ate my meatloaf. I drank my milk. I cleared the table. It wasn't that they hated me. Hate requires passion. Hate requires energy. If they hated me, they would have remembered the day just to spite me. This was something colder. This was indifference. I was a piece of furniture that had been in the house so long they no longer saw it. I was a utility, not a person. I went to my room at 8:30 p.m. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. I didn't cry. I had learned by then that crying only made my face blotchy, which annoyed my mother. I just felt hollow, like someone had scooped the insides out of me. Then there was a tap on the glass. I looked up. My bedroom was on the ground floor, facing the rear of the property where the old guest cottage stood. Standing outside my window, framed by the moonlight, was my grandfather Silas. Silas was my mother's father, but he seemed to belong to a different species entirely. He was a retired structural engineer, a man who spoke in short, clipped sentences and smelled of pipe tobacco and old parchment. He lived in the cottage, keeping a polite but firm distance from the performative anxieties of the main house. I opened the window. "Put your coat on," Silas whispered, his breath plumed in the cold night air. "Come outside." I grabbed my jacket and climbed out the window. We walked in silence to the stone steps of his cottage. The dry leaves crunched under our feet, the only sound in the world. We sat on the cold stone. Silas took a long drag from his pipe, the embers glowing orange in the dark. He didn't look at me. He looked up at the stars. 10 years, he said. His voice was gravel, rough, but not unkind. That's a full decade. They forgot, I said. My voice cracked. It was the first time I had spoken the truth aloud. I know, Silas said. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't say they've been busy or they love you in their own way. He respected me too much to lie. People show you who they are, Arthur. Your job is to believe them the first time. He reached into the pocket of his heavy wool cardigan and pulled out a small object wrapped in a blue handkerchief. He handed it to me. Happy birthday. I unwrapped it slowly. It was heavy, cold metal, a compass. It wasn't a toy from a gift shop. It was an antique military compass, brass and glass, with a heavy lid that snapped shut with a satisfying click. Look at the needle, Silas said. I held it flat. The needle swung wildly for a moment, trembling, before settling into a dead stillness, pointing north. It doesn't matter how dark it gets, Silas said softly. It doesn't matter if you spin around. It doesn't matter if everyone around you is screaming or running in the wrong direction. That needle knows where it stands. It knows the truth. I ran my thumb over the brass casing. Why doesn't the needle change? Because it's guided by something bigger than the room it's in, Silas said. He turned to me, his eyes sharp under his bushy brows. You need to be like that, Arthur. They are going to forget you, again and again. They are going to overlook you for Elias. They are going to take you for granted. If you look to them for your direction, you will be lost forever. You have to find your own north. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. Let them play their games. Let them have their noise. You watch, you listen, you keep your course, and one day, the bill will come due. That night, in the cold October air of 1996, a contract was signed in my heart. I stopped waiting for them to love me. I stopped waiting for the cake. I took the compass, and I hid it under my pillow. I went to sleep with a new understanding. I was invisible to them, yes. But invisibility had a power of its own. It meant I could see them while they never thought to look at me. By the time I reached 18, the dynamic in our house had calcified into a rigid caste system. If my childhood was defined by invisibility, my adolescence was defined by utility. I had learned a hard but valuable lesson. If I wanted to exist in the orbit of my parents, I had to be useful. I had to pay rent in labor. I became the fixer. I was the one who figured out how to set up the wireless router when the technology first arrived, saving my father a $100 service call. I was the one who deciphered the tax codes to maximize their deductions. I mowed the lawn in perfect diagonals, cleaned the gutters, and detailed their cars. I thought, perhaps subconsciously, that I could earn my way into their affection through sweat equity. It was a transaction that never balanced. Elias, meanwhile, had graduated high school in 2003 with grades that were aggressively mediocre. He was currently taking a gap year that had stretched into 2. This mostly involved sleeping until noon, playing video games in the finished basement, and networking at parties. The disparity in our value became undeniable in the spring of 2005. I was finishing my senior year. I had applied to universities quietly, without their help. I chose accounting as my major. It wasn't a passion born of excitement. It was a choice born of a desperate need for order. Accounting is the language of truth. In a ledger, assets must equal liabilities plus equity. There is no room for interpretation. There is no room for favorites. Numbers do not lie. I had been accepted into the state university's business school. I had secured a partial academic scholarship, but I still needed help with the room and board for the freshman year. I had run the numbers. I needed $6,000 to bridge the gap until I could get a work-study job. On a rainy Tuesday in April, I sat my parents down at the mahogany dining table. I had prepared a spreadsheet. "I've mapped out the costs," I said, sliding the paper toward my father. "I have the scholarship covering tuition. I just need help with the dorm fees and the meal plan. I'll pay you back after graduation with interest." My father didn't look at the paper. He was staring at the window, watching the rain hit the glass. He sighed, a long, heavy sound that suggested my very existence was a tax on his energy. "We're a bit stretched right now, Arthur," he said. "The market is volatile. My portfolio took a hit last quarter." "It's $6,000, I said calmly. "You spent $4,000 on the landscaping for the spring party last month." "That was essential for appearances," my mother chimed in. She was filing her nails, the emery board making a rhythmic rich, rich, rich sound. "You have to understand, Arthur, money isn't infinite. We have to prioritize." "I am prioritizing," I said. "This is my education." "You're smart," my father said, waving his hand dismissively. "You'll figure it out. You always do. Maybe you can take a year off, work at the grocery store, save up?" I looked at them. They weren't broke. I knew they weren't broke because I saw the credit card statements I fished out of the mail for them. They just didn't want to spend the money on me. 2 weeks later, the priorities became clear. I came home from school to find a vehicle sitting in the driveway. It wasn't just a car, it was a statement. A 2005 Ford Mustang GT Black, leather interior. The sticker was still in the window. Elias was standing next to it, holding the keys, grinning like he had just invented the wheel. My parents were standing on the porch, beaming. "Look at that beauty!" my father shouted. "Now that is a machine!" I walked up the driveway, my backpack heavy on my shoulders. I stopped in front of my mother. "Whose car is this?" I asked, though I already knew. "It's for Elias," my mother said, her voice bright and defensive. "The transmission on his old Civic was shot. We couldn't have him driving around in a death trap. He has potential interviews coming up. He needs reliable transport." "Interviews?" I asked. "He works part-time at the video store." "He's looking for better opportunities," my father corrected, stepping off the porch to admire the rims. "We're investing in his future, Arthur. You shouldn't be jealous. It's unbecoming." I did the math in my head. The car was at least $25,000, 4 times what I had asked for. "I see," I said. "The market recovered then?" My father's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone. We do the best we can for both of you." I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply nodded, walked past the shiny new car, and went into the house. That afternoon, I went to the bank and signed the paperwork for a high-interest private student loan. I indebted my future self because my present self was worth less to them than a V8 engine. But grandfather Silas had been watching. Silas was slower now. The years were eroding him. He walked with a cane, and his hands had developed a persistent tremor, but his eyes were still sharp. In July, a week before I was set to move out, he called me into the cottage. The air inside was thick with the smell of old paper and tobacco. He was sitting at his heavy oak desk, a singular lamp illuminating a ledger. "Close the door," he rasped. I closed it. "Come here. Look at this." I walked around to the desk. The ledger was open. It wasn't a checkbook, it was a log, a handwritten, meticulous record of every financial interaction he had observed in the family for the last decade. Silas was a structural engineer. He believed in data. I read the entries. June 3rd, 1998. Elias birthday, $400. Dirt bike incident. October 14th, 1998. Arthur birthday, $0. December 25th, 2001. Christmas. Elias, gaming console, $299. Arthur, socks/sweater, $45. May 2005. Elias vehicle purchase, $26,500. Check number 4402. May 2005. Arthur tuition request. Denied, $0. I stared at the ink. Seeing it written down in black and white hit me harder than the events themselves. It was proof. It wasn't in my head. "Why?" I asked, looking up at him. "Evidence," Silas wheezed. He tapped the page with a bony finger. "Memory is faulty, Arthur. Emotion clouds judgment. Sentimentality is a liar. But numbers? Data is absolute. I have been watching. I have been tallying." He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was sealed with red wax, stamped with his ring. "This is for Mr. Henderson," Silas said. Mr. Henderson was his attorney, a man I had met only once who looked like he had been carved out of granite. "You are not to give this to him yet," Silas instructed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You are to keep it safe. Hide it. When I die, and I will die, Arthur, likely before you graduate, you will bring this to Henderson immediately, before the funeral, before they can start looting the house. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, heavier than paper should feel. "They think I'm a senile old man rotting in the garden," Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that turned into a cough. "They think I don't see who pays for the groceries and who eats them. They are measuring the drapes for my coffin, Arthur, but I have drafted the blueprints for their surprise." "Grandfather," I said, "thank you." "Don't thank me," he snapped gently. "Just survive, go to school, get your degree, become the man they don't think you can be, and keep that compass." I took the envelope. I wrapped it in a t-shirt and hid it inside the lining of my old suitcase, the one I had bought from a thrift store because my parents wouldn't let me use the good luggage. 2 weeks later, I moved out. My departure was not an event. There were no balloons. There were no tears. My parents were too busy planning a bon voyage party for Elias, who had decided to go to Europe for 3 weeks to find himself before looking for a job. They were discussing exchange rates and hotels in Paris at the breakfast table. "I'm leaving now," I said, standing in the doorway with my boxes. "Okay, drive safe," my mother said, not looking up from her travel brochure. "Text us when you get there." "Make sure you change your mailing address," my father added. "I don't want your junk mail cluttering up the hall table." "I will," I said. I walked out to my car, a rusted 10-year-old compact I had bought with my own landscaping money. I loaded the trunk. I looked back at the house. It was a beautiful house, a perfect house, and it was completely empty of anything that mattered. I didn't slam the door. I didn't spin the tires. I just put the car in gear and drove away. As I merged onto the highway, heading toward a life of debt and solitude, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had the compass in my pocket, I had the envelope in my trunk, and I had the ledger in my mind. I was playing the long game now, and unlike them, I knew the score. The years between 2006 and 2013 were defined by a deliberate, calculated distance. If my childhood was a study in being ignored, my 20s were a masterclass in becoming unreachable. I graduated summa cum laude from the university in 2009. My parents did not attend the ceremony. They sent a card, signed by my mother, with a $50 check enclosed. The memo line read, "For dinner." Elias, I later learned, had wrecked the Mustang the previous week, and the resulting drama had consumed the family's entire bandwidth. I didn't cash the check. I framed it. It hung in my hallway, a reminder of my current market value in their eyes. I secured my CPA license immediately after graduation and joined a mid-sized, respectable accounting firm in the city, 2 hours away from my childhood home. I chose the firm not for its prestige, but for its culture of rigid adherence to the rules. I found comfort in the black and white nature of tax law. In my office, there were no favorites. There were only audits, balances, and the immutable truth of the bottom line. I crafted a life of extreme order. My apartment was minimalist, gray furniture, clean lines, no clutter. My bills were paid on autodraft 3 days before they were due. I built a savings account that grew with the slow, steady rhythm of compound interest. My contact with my family became sporadic and strictly transactional. They only called when the world, which they felt entitled to, stopped cooperating with them. The calls usually came on Tuesday nights. "Arthur," my father would say, bypassing pleasantries, "we got a letter from the IRS. They're claiming we underpaid in 08. Can you look at it? I think their math is wrong." "Fax it to me," I would say. "I'll look at it on Sunday." "Sunday? Can't you do it tonight? It's stressful, Arthur. Your mother is having palpitations." "I'm working, Dad. Sunday." I never charged them for the work, but I never prioritized it either. I became a distant utility, like a satellite they occasionally pinged for data. Elias was drifting. The gap year had turned into a gap decade. He tried to start a DJ business. He tried to be a lifestyle consultant. He moved back into the main house in 2010, occupying his old room, which my mother had redecorated to look like a shrine to his high school athletic career. But the real focal point of those years was the slow, agonizing decline of grandfather Silas. I visited him once a month. I established a protocol to minimize collateral damage. I drove down on Sunday mornings, parking my car 2 streets over so my parents wouldn't see it in the driveway. I walked through the wooded path that connected the back of the property to the main road, entering the guest cottage directly without going near the main house. Silas was fading. The sharp, cynical engineer was being eroded by time and biology. By 2011, he was wheelchair-bound. His speech had become slurred, the result of a series of mini-strokes that were slowly shutting down the powerhouse of his mind. My mother had taken over his care. In practice, this meant she controlled his checkbook and complained about the burden of his existence. "It's exhausting," she told me during one of the rare times I ran into her in the garden. "He's so demanding, and the cost of the home health aides, it's bleeding us dry." I knew for a fact, having seen Silas's accounts during my secret visits, that his pension and investment dividends more than covered his care. My parents were simply skimming off the top, treating his income as a household subsidy. The turning point, the moment that solidified my resolve, came in the winter of 2012. I arrived at the cottage on a snowy December afternoon. I let myself in with the spare key Silas had given me years ago. The cottage was warm, but it smelled of antiseptic and neglect. Silas was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, a blanket draped over his legs. He was staring out at the snow-covered garden. He looked small. The formidable man who had given me the compass was gone, replaced by a fragile shell. But he wasn't alone. My mother was there, and she was with a contractor. They were standing in the center of the room, holding blueprints. "We want to open this wall up," my mother was saying, gesturing to the wall filled with Silas's bookshelves, shelves lined with the engineering texts he had collected for 50 years. "It makes the room feel so claustrophobic. If we knock this out, we can put in a skylight. It would make a perfect studio for Elias. He's getting into photography now, and he needs the natural light." The contractor, a burly man in work boots, nodded. "We'd have to reinforce the header, but it's doable. When are you looking to start?" "Well," my mother lowered her voice, casting a quick, dismissive glance at Silas. "Obviously, we have to wait until The situation changes, but we want to be ready to break ground immediately. We don't want the space sitting dead. I stood in the doorway, the cold air from outside still clinging to my coat. They hadn't seen me yet. "He's not dead yet, Mother," I said. My voice was level, but it cut through the room like a razor. My mother jumped. The blueprints crinkled in her hands. "Arthur! Good Lord, you scared me. I didn't hear a car." "I walked," I said. "You're measuring the room for a renovation while he's sitting in it?" She flushed, a patch of red rising on her neck. "Don't be morbid. We're just planning. Being pragmatic. Dad doesn't mind, do you, Dad?" Silas didn't move. He kept staring out the window. "He can't even hear us half the time," she whispered to me as if that made it better. "His hearing aids are out. Look, Arthur, while you're here, Elias got a speeding ticket in a school zone. Can you call that lawyer friend of yours, the one who handled the DUI?" "I don't have a lawyer friend who handles DUIs," I lied. "I'm an accountant." "Well, ask around. It's unfair." The sign was obscured by a tree branch. She turned back to the contractor. "Let's look at the bathroom. I want a soaking tub." They walked into the back room. I walked over to Silas. I pulled a chair up next to his wheelchair and sat down. I wasn't sure if he was awake or drifting in the twilight state he often occupied. "Grandfather," I whispered. Slowly, painfully, his head turned. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but as they locked onto mine, something sparked. A flicker of the old intelligence. He moved his hand on the armrest. It was a struggle, the neurons firing through a damaged network, but he managed it. He tapped his index finger against the leather. Tap, tap, tap. 3 taps. It was a code we had developed over the last year as his speech failed. 1 tap meant water, 2 taps meant pain, 3 taps meant stay the course. I reached out and covered his hand with mine. His skin was like parchment paper, dry and cool. "I have the envelope," I whispered to him. "It's safe. It's waiting." He blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. Then he tapped again. Tap, tap, tap. He knew. He knew they were measuring the walls. He knew they were spending his money in their heads. He knew they were waiting for him to die so they could finally cannibalize his legacy to feed their own vanity. "I won't let them win," I promised him. He squeezed my hand. It was weak, a ghost of a grip, but the intent was iron. I stayed with him for an hour, reading aloud from one of his engineering books, a treatise on load-bearing structures. He seemed to relax, the rhythm of the technical language soothing him. When I left, I passed my mother in the kitchen. She was looking at tile samples. "Leaving already?" she asked. "I have a long drive." "Okay, drive safe." "Oh." She paused, looking at me with a vague expression of confusion. "Did we miss your birthday? That was last week, right?" It was December. My birthday was in October. "It was 2 months ago," I said. "Right. Well, happy belated. We'll do a big dinner next year, a really big one, maybe at the club." "Sure," I said. "Next year." I walked out into the snow. I didn't look back at the main house. I walked through the woods to my car. As I drove home, the anger didn't feel hot anymore. It had cooled into something solid and heavy, like a stone in my gut. They had forgotten my birthday again, yes, but that was a small sin compared to what I had just witnessed. They had ceased to see Silas as a human being. He was just an obstacle between them and a payout. I touched the dashboard of my car. "Stay the course," he had said. I would. I would wait. I would let them plan their renovations. I would let them dream of soaking tubs and photography studios. I would let them build their castles in the air, and when the time came, I would show them the foundation. The end did not come with a bang. It came with the persistent, rhythmic beeping of a machine in a sterile room, counting down the seconds of a life that had been quietly monumental. It was February 2014. A blizzard had settled over New England, burying the world in 3 feet of white silence. I was awake when the phone rang at 3:14 a.m. I was always awake at 3 a.m. in those days. Insomnia had become a companion. I saw my father's name on the caller ID, My stomach turned over, a physical reaction, not to him, but to the news I knew he was carrying. "It's Silas," my father said. His voice was thick with sleep, but devoid of urgency. "Massive stroke. The ambulance just took him. They say you should come if you want to. You know, say goodbye." "I'm leaving now," I said. I drove 2 hours through the storm. The highway was a tunnel of swirling snow, the headlights cutting a fragile path through the dark. I didn't listen to the radio. I gripped the steering wheel and thought about the compass. True north, I told myself. Just keep driving north. When I arrived at the hospital, the scene was exactly as I had anticipated, yet it still possessed the power to make my skin crawl. Silas was in a private room at the end of the hall. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rattling. The death rattle, the nurses called it. He looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, a collection of bones and translucent skin. My mother was there, sitting in the armchair next to the bed. She was crying. But it was a performance. I had watched her cry for 30 years. I knew the difference between the tears of grief and the tears of an audience. She was weeping for the benefit of the night nurse who was adjusting the IV drip. "He was such a strong man," my mother sobbed, dabbing her eyes with a tissue that remained suspiciously dry. "We took such good care of him. We sacrificed so much to keep him at home." The nurse nodded sympathetically. "You were a good daughter." I stood in the doorway, melting snow dripping from my coat onto the linoleum. My mother looked up. "Arthur," she said, her voice dropping the tragic octave instantly. "You made it. The roads are terrible." "Where is Elias?" I asked. "He's in the cafeteria getting coffee. He's very shaken up. He and Granddad were so close." I almost laughed. It would have been a bitter, jagged sound. Elias hadn't visited the cottage in 6 months, despite living 50 yards away from it. I walked to the bedside. I ignored my mother. I ignored the nurse. I looked at Silas. He was gone already. The body was there, the chest was rising and falling, but the spark, the engineer, the observer, the man who knew the value of a promise, had departed. I placed my hand on his shoulder. It was cold. "I'm here," I whispered. I stood there for 3 hours. The sun began to rise, painting the snow outside in shades of gray and blue. Elias eventually wandered in, holding a grandiose latte. He looked bored. He checked his phone. He sighed. He paced. "How much longer do they think?" Elias whispered loudly to my father, who had arrived shortly after me. "Shh," my father hissed. "It takes as long as it takes." "I'm just saying, my phone is dying and I didn't bring a charger." At 6:42 a.m., the rhythm of the machine changed. The beep became a singular, flat tone. The room suspended in time. The nurse moved quickly to check the vitals. She turned off the machine. She looked at us with a practiced, professional sorrow. "I'm sorry," she said. "He's gone." My mother let out a wail. It was loud, theatrical, and perfectly timed. She threw herself onto my father's shoulder. "Oh, God, what are we going to do without him?" she cried. I watched them. I watched my father pat her back while looking over her shoulder at the doctor who had just entered the room. I watched Elias awkwardly put his latte down on the windowsill. And then the shift happened. It was subtle, but to someone who had been studying them for a lifetime, it was as loud as a thunderclap. The moment the doctor pronounced the time of death and left the room, my mother straightened up. She wiped her face. The grief evaporated, replaced instantly by administrative efficiency. "Well," she said, smoothing her skirt, "there is a lot to do. We need to call the funeral home. Richard, you need to call the bank first thing Monday. We need to freeze the accounts before the state gets involved." "I'm on it," my father said. "Do we have the key to his desk? The roll-top one?" "I think it's in his nightstand," my mother said. "We need to find the will. He told me years ago it was in the top drawer. We have to make sure we get everything in order before the service." "I don't want any probate delays. The contractor is ready to start in March." They were discussing the renovation of his home over his still warm body. "I'm going to go," I said. My voice sounded hollow to my own ears. Go? My mother looked at me annoyed. We need you to help. We have to clear out the cottage. I need to get some air, I said. I'll be back. I walked out. I didn't stop at the cafeteria. I walked straight out the automatic doors into the biting cold of the parking lot. The wind hit me like a physical blow, freezing the tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. I walked to my car. I opened the trunk. I lifted the false bottom where the spare tire sat. Underneath, wedged next to the jack, was the old suitcase I had packed when I was 18. I unzipped the lining. The manila envelope was there. It had been waiting in the dark for 9 years. The red wax seal was cracked from the temperature changes, but it was still intact. It felt heavy in my hands, not just the weight of the paper, but the weight of the justice it contained. I didn't go back to the hospital. I got in my car and drove. I didn't drive to the cottage. I drove to the city, to the address Silas had made me memorize. Henderson and Associates, attorneys at law. It was a Saturday morning. The office was technically closed, but Silas had given me a number, a direct line to Mr. Henderson's personal cell. I had called him from the hospital parking lot. He's gone, was all I said. Meet me at the back entrance in 45 minutes, Henderson had replied. His voice was gravel, shaken by nothing. I pulled into the empty office lot. A man was waiting by the rear door. He was wearing a heavy wool coat and a fedora. He looked like a noir detective from a different era. He was older now, his hair completely white, but he stood as straight as a steel beam. I got out of the car. I walked up to him. I held out the envelope. Henderson looked at the envelope, then at my face. He didn't smile. He nodded. He told me you would bring this, Henderson said. He told me that if you brought it, it meant you had kept your promise. It meant you hadn't broken. I didn't break, I said. Come inside, Arthur. It's cold. We sat in his office. It was a room of mahogany and leather, smelling of old books, a scent that painfully reminded me of the cottage. Henderson broke the seal. He pulled out the documents. He also pulled out a small, silver flash drive. What is that? I asked. Insurance, Henderson said. Silas knew his daughter. He knew she would contest the paper. She would claim forgery, dementia, coercion. This, he held up the drive, is the rebuttal. He scanned the documents. A small, tight smile appeared on his face. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator who knows the trap has been successfully sprung. Your family is expecting a standard reading, Henderson said. They are expecting the 2002 will, the one that leaves the estate to your mother with a trust for Elias. Yes, I said. They are looking for it in his desk right now. They won't find it, Henderson said. Silas had me destroy the original years ago. He left a dummy copy, a draft. It has no legal standing. He placed his hands on the desk. The funeral is Thursday? Yes. I will contact your parents on Monday. I will tell them that I am the executor of the estate and that the reading of the last will and testament will take place on Friday, the day after the funeral. They'll be expecting a check, I said. Let them expect, Henderson said. Let them grieve in their own way. Let them plan. Let them order the skylights. Let them spend money they don't have yet. It will make the lesson more effective. Is it cruel? I asked. The question had been gnawing at me. To let them think they've won? Henderson looked at me over the rim of his spectacles. His eyes were hard. Arthur, justice often feels like cruelty to those who have never been held accountable for their actions. They erased you for 20 years. They waited for a good man to die so they could rob him. This isn't cruelty. This is the bill coming due. I nodded. Friday, I said. Friday, Henderson agreed. I left the office. I drove back to my parents' house to help with the arrangements. I played the part. I nodded when they talked about the casket costs. I listened when Elias complained about having to wear a suit. I watched them move through the world with the arrogance of people who believe they are the main characters of the universe. I said nothing. I held the secret in my chest like a burning coal. I had my compass. I knew where north was, and I knew that the storm was about to break. The reading of the will took place on a Tuesday morning in late January 2015. The city was gripped by a deep freeze, the kind that turns the sidewalks into sheets of gray iron. Mr. Henderson's office was located in a pre-war building downtown, a place of high ceilings, mahogany paneling, and the hushed, expensive silence that only law firms and cathedrals seem to possess. I arrived early. I sat in the waiting room reading a magazine I wasn't actually looking at. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Not out of fear, but out of a strange, suspended anticipation. It was the feeling of waiting for a dam to break. My family arrived 10 minutes late. They swept in with a flurry of noise and entitlement. My mother was wearing a new black coat that I knew cost more than my first car. My father looked impatient, checking his watch. Elias was wearing a suit that didn't fit him properly, looking like a child playing dress-up. They saw me sitting there. "Arthur," my father said, surprised. "I didn't think you'd come. You have work." "I took a personal day," I said. "Well, good," my mother said, adjusting her hair in the reflection of a framed diploma. "It's good to show respect, even if there's not much for you to do here. We'll probably go to lunch afterwards. Maybe you can join us if you don't have to rush back." The receptionist opened the heavy double doors. "Mr. Henderson is ready for you." We filed into the conference room. It was imposing. A long oak table dominated the space. Walls of leather-bound legal texts surrounded us, creating an acoustic dead zone where no sound could escape. Mr. Henderson sat at the head of the table. He didn't stand when we entered. He watched us over the rim of his glasses, his expression unreadable. My parents and Elias took seats on the left side of the table. They spread out, claiming the space. I sat on the right, alone. "Let's get this over with," my father said, drumming his fingers on the wood. "We have contractors coming at 2 o'clock to do a walkthrough of the cottage. We're on a tight schedule." Henderson opened a thick leather folder in front of him. The sound of the heavy paper turning was the only noise in the room. "Silas Arthur Blackwood left a last will and testament dated October 12, 2014, Henderson began. His voice was a deep baritone that demanded absolute attention. My mother frowned. She leaned forward. "Excuse me? 2014? No, that's incorrect. The will is from 2002. We saw it in his desk. We have a copy." "That will was revoked," Henderson said smoothly. He didn't look up. "Mr. Blackwood drafted a new document 3 months prior to his passing. I oversaw the drafting and the signing myself." "That's impossible," my father snapped. He wasn't well. He was confused. He had strokes. Any document he signed in 2014 would be contested on the grounds of competency. Henderson stopped. He closed the folder. He looked at my father with a gaze that could strip paint. "Mr. Blackwood anticipated this objection," Henderson said, "which is why we took the precaution of video recording the signing, along with a competency evaluation by 2 independent psychiatrists." Henderson pressed a button on a laptop sitting on the side table. A large screen on the wall flickered to life. My family froze. Silas appeared on the screen. He was sitting in his wheelchair in Henderson's office. He looked frail, yes, but his eyes were clear. He was looking directly into the camera lens. "I am recording this statement freely." Silas's voice filled the room, raspy but distinct. "I know my daughter, Marie. She will say I was confused. She will say I was manipulated. I am neither. I am simply observant." On the screen, Silas took a sip of water. "I have watched my family for the last 10 years, he continued. "I have watched them spend my money before I was dead. I have watched them treat my home as a waiting room for their inheritance. And I have watched them erase my grandson, Arthur." My mother went pale. Her hand flew to her mouth. Elias shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "This will," Silas said, tapping the document on his lap in the video, "is my final judgment. It is the only truth that matters." The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum. "To my daughter, Marie, and her husband, Robert," Henderson read, returning to the document. "I leave the sum of $10,000. $10,000? My father stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "That's a joke. The estate is worth millions. The land alone—
"Sit down, Mr. Blackwood,"
Henderson said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. My father sat, stunned. "The sum of $10,000, Henderson continued, "is calculated based on the receipts I have kept of your expenditures on my behalf over the last 5 years. You claimed to be my caretakers. I have reimbursed you for every gallon of milk, every hour of supervision you claimed to provide, and every tank of gas used to drive me to appointments I never went to. The ledger is attached as Exhibit A." Henderson slid a photocopy of a ledger page across the table. My mother looked at it. It was her handwriting on the receipts. She looked like she was going to be sick. "To my grandson, Elias," Henderson read. Elias straightened up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I leave my 1996 Ford F-150 truck. It is a sturdy vehicle. You will need it for work." Elias blinked. "The truck? That rusty piece of junk in the barn? Where's the trust? Where's the portfolio?" Henderson turned the page. He took a breath. He looked at me. "The remainder of my estate," Henderson read, slowing down for emphasis, "including the property at 44 Oak Lane, the patent royalties, the investment portfolio, the liquid cash assets, and all personal effects, is left to my grandson, Arthur." My mother let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. "No!" "There is, however, a condition," Henderson said. "The birthday clause." "The what?" my father asked, his voice trembling with rage. Henderson read from the document verbatim. "I have observed that Arthur has been invisible in this family for 20 years. His birthday has been ignored while Elias's has been celebrated with excess. Therefore, the transfer of the estate is immediate. Furthermore, Arthur is granted full and immediate legal authority to manage the residency of the property at 44 Oak Lane. He may evict the current residents, my daughter and her husband, should he choose to do so." My mother looked at me. Her eyes were wide, terrified, and for the first time in my life, she was actually seeing me. Not as furniture, not as a utility, but as the person holding the pen. "You can't do that," she whispered. "Arthur, that's our home. We raised you there." "It was Silas's home," Henderson corrected. "It is now Arthur's home." Henderson reached into the folder and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. He slid it across the mahogany table toward me. "Arthur, your grandfather left a personal note for you to read at this time." I picked it up. My hands were steady. I unfolded the paper. It was Silas's shaky, distinctive handwriting. "Arthur, they forgot the day you were born. I made sure they will never forget the day I died. The compass points north. You know the way. Happy birthday. Silas." I folded the note and put it in my pocket. I looked up at my family. My father was red-faced, sputtering about lawsuits and undue influence. Elias looked like he had been punched in the gut, the entitlement draining out of him, leaving behind a terrified child. My mother was weeping, clutching my father's arm. "Arthur," she pleaded, "you wouldn't— We're family. We made mistakes, sure, but you can't kick us out. We have nowhere to go. We have the renovation planned. We have debts." I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I picked up the folder Henderson offered me. I felt the weight of it. It was the weight of 20 years of silence. "I'm giving you 90 days, I said. My voice was calm. It didn't shake. "That is 3 times the legal requirement for eviction. You have until April 30th to vacate the property." "Where will we go?" my father asked, his voice cracking. "Arthur, be reasonable. We can't afford a new place right now. My liquidity is tied up." I looked at him. I remembered the dining room table in 2005. I remembered asking for tuition. I remembered his dismissal. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said, echoing the exact words he had spoken to me a decade ago. "You're smart. You always do." I turned to Henderson. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I'll be in touch regarding the deed transfer." "Arthur!" my mother screamed as I turned to the door. "Arthur, come back here! You ungrateful—" I walked out of the conference room. I walked through the heavy double doors. I walked past the receptionist. I walked out into the cold January air. The wind bit at my face, but I didn't feel it. I felt warm. I felt light. I didn't hate them. I realized that as I walked to my car, I didn't want to destroy them. I just wanted them to experience for the first time in their lives the consequences of their own indifference. They had spent a lifetime banking on a future that belonged to someone else. Now, the ledger was balanced. The eviction was legal, orderly, and devastatingly quiet. I did not supervise it personally. I knew that if I stood in the driveway and watched them load the moving trucks, the moment would degrade into a screaming match or, worse, a scene of groveling that I didn't have the stomach for. I wanted justice, not theater. I hired a property management firm to handle the transition. I gave them strict instructions: assess the property, ensure the occupants vacated by noon on April 30th, 2015, and change the locks immediately. I spent that day at my office, staring at spreadsheets, though my mind was 10 miles away at 44 Oak Lane. My phone buzzed incessantly. 14 missed calls from my mother, 6 from my father. A long, rambling text from Elias that oscillated between begging for cash and threatening to expose me to the family, though he never specified what he would expose or to whom. I didn't answer. Silence was the only language they understood now. When the confirmation call came from the property manager at 12:15 p.m.,
"The property is secured, Mr. Blackwood."
I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I felt a sudden, crushing exhaustion. It was the feeling of putting down a heavy weight I had been carrying since I was 10 years old. I visited the house one last time in May. It was empty. The furniture they had taken left ghost outlines on the carpets. The walls, stripped of my mother's curated art, looked bare and honest. I walked into the kitchen. I stood in the spot where I had eaten my birthday meatloaf in silence for a decade. I walked to the guest cottage. The wall hadn't been knocked down. There was no skylight. There was just the smell of pipe tobacco, faint but persistent, clinging to the wood. I listed the property the next week. The market in 2015 was strong. The house sold in July to a young family from New York, an architect and his wife who wanted to raise their kids with a big backyard. They seemed kind. They didn't know the history of the walls. That was good. The house needed new memories to flush out the old ones. The proceeds from the sale, combined with Silas's investment portfolio and the patent royalties, placed me in a tax bracket that my parents had only ever pretended to occupy. But wealth, I discovered, is not about buying Ferraris. It is about the ability to say no. I quit my job at the firm. I was tired of the fluorescent lights and the corporate hierarchy. I started my own boutique consultancy, working with small business owners, people who actually made things, people who needed help, people who paid their bills on time. I worked fewer hours. I made more money. I answered to no one. The fate of my family played out like a slow-motion car crash in the rearview mirror. Without the safety net of Silas's money and the equity of the house, their lifestyle collapsed with shocking speed. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex 3 towns over. It was a perfectly adequate place to live, clean, safe, functional. But to my mother, it was a gulag. It had thin walls. It had shared laundry. It had neighbors who didn't care about her social standing because, frankly, she no longer had any. My father was forced to delay his retirement. He went back to consulting, but the industry had changed, and he was a man out of time, bitter and difficult to work with. And Elias? Elias had to get a job. A real job. The lifestyle consulting and DJ dreams evaporated when he realized rent wasn't optional. He sold the broken Mustang for scrap. He started driving the 1996 Ford F-150 Silas had left him. I saw him once in 2017, stopped at a traffic light. He was wearing a uniform for a car rental agency. He looked tired. He looked ordinary. He looked like everyone else. I didn't honk. I just drove past. They didn't disappear entirely. They were persistent. For the first 2 years, they tried to find the cracks in the armor. I would get emails. Arthur, your father needs dental work. It's $4,000. Surely the trust can cover medical necessities. Arthur, the truck needs a new alternator. It was Granddad's truck. You should pay to maintain it. Arthur, it's Christmas. We're family. I developed a standard response. I blamed the paperwork. I blamed the lawyers. The funds are locked in a long-term yield structure. I would lie, typing the words from the deck of the beach house I had bought on the Rhode Island coast. Mr. Henderson has strict protocols. My hands are tied. It wasn't true. I could have written them a check for $1 million and not felt it. But I knew that if I gave them $1, they would feel entitled to 10. If I gave them 10, they would hate me for not giving them 20. There is no filling a cup that has no bottom. The years drifted by. 2016, 2017, 2018. I built a life, a real one. I made friends who didn't know my last name was associated with drama. I dated a woman named Elena, a marine biologist who loved the ocean as much as I did. She didn't care about the money. She cared that I was kind. She cared that I listened. I told her the story once, late at night, watching a storm roll in off the Atlantic. "Do you hate them?" she asked. "No," I said, and I meant it. Hate takes too much energy. I don't need them. It's like an appendix. It used to be part of me, but it got infected, so I cut it out. Now I'm just healing. The healing wasn't linear. There were days I felt guilty. Days I wondered if I was the villain. But then I would look at the compass on my desk, Silas's compass, and I would remember the birthday dinners with no cake. I would remember the blueprints for the studio over a dying man's bed, and I would stay the course. The final test came in the autumn of 2019. October 14th, 2019, I turned 33. It was a Monday. I had taken the day off. The weather was spectacular. That specific piercing blue sky that only exists in New England in October. The air smelled of salt spray and dying leaves. I woke up without an alarm. I made coffee in my kitchen, which was filled with light. I walked out onto the deck. The ocean was calm, a sheet of hammered steel stretching to the horizon. My phone buzzed on the railing. I looked at it. A text message from my mother. "Happy birthday, Arthur. Hope you're doing well." 33! Wow, Dad's back is acting up again, and the rent is going up next month. We were wondering if maybe we could meet for coffee. We miss you. I stared at the screen. In the past, that message would have ruined my day. It would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and anger. I would have analyzed the manipulation, the happy birthday used as a Trojan horse for the request for rent money. But that morning, standing in the cold, clean air of 2019, I felt nothing. No spike of adrenaline, no pit in my stomach. It was just text on a screen, pixels of light. I didn't delete it. I didn't block them. That would have been a reaction. I simply put the phone down, face down, on the table. I went back inside. Elena was awake. She had made pancakes. There was a small pile of presents on the table, wrapped in blue paper. "Happy birthday," she said, smiling. "Coffee?" "Please," I said. I sat down. I opened the gifts. A vintage map of the coastline, a sweater, a book I had mentioned wanting months ago. "Thank you," I said. "You remembered." "Of course I remembered," she said, pouring the coffee. "It's your birthday." I looked out the window at the sea. I thought about Silas. I thought about the ledger. The ledger was closed now. The debts were paid. The balance was 0. I didn't need their acknowledgement to exist. I didn't need their apology to move forward. I had waited. I had endured, and I had built a fortress of peace that they could not breach. I picked up the compass from the mantel. I opened the lid. The brass was warm in my hand. The needle swung for a moment, dancing before settling into that familiar, unyielding line. True north. The world could spin. My parents could scheme. The years could pass. But I knew where I stood. I was Arthur Blackwood. I was 33 years old. I was seen by the people who mattered. And for the first time in my life, when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a ghost. I saw a man. I took a sip of coffee. I smiled at Elena. "Let's go for a walk," I said. "The tide is coming in." We walked out into the light, leaving the phone and the silence behind us.